free capital movement weakens labor's bargaining power. Why? Because labor is less mobile internationally than capital. So capital can always threaten that you better accept my deal, otherwise we'll go to another country. Labor cannot give that threat credibly.
You are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Dan Bannock.
My guest this week is the eminent economist Pranab Bardhan, who has undertaken pioneering research on international trade, the political economy of development policies, decentralized governance, and the political economy of development in China and India. Pranab Bardhan is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. We began by discussing the role of globalization in reducing world poverty and the main findings of his forthcoming book from Harvard University Press, A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries. We thereafter discussed the democracy-development relationship and the China-India comparison before focusing on the corruption-development relationship. Thanks for all the positive feedback we received in the past few weeks. Please continue to contact us by email or on social media with your questions, comments, and suggestions. I hope you enjoy our conversation. I'm so thrilled, Pranab, to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's begin by discussing the relationship, say, between globalization, inequality, and poverty reduction, because there is this kind of phenomenal growth, right, in academic interest on this relationship. There's this ongoing debate on the actual links between globalization and inequality. But perhaps what has received lesser attention, not in your work, you've been highlighting this, is that link between globalization on the one hand and domestic politics in relation to poverty reduction on the other hand. So let's begin by discussing how you view the fact that maybe globalization affects policies on poverty and inequality irrespective of its source. So how would you characterize today the relationship between globalization and egalitarian public policy?
Let me first say, I think globalization covers a very large number of issues. I think it is important to separate out the issues related to international trade, which is a big part of globalization, from those relating to capital flows, because I think those have different kind of economic issues involved and also different kinds of politics sometimes. Now, in general, globalization, whether it will increase inequality or whether it will change the distribution of income, if you go back to kind of simple elementary international trade theory, that will depend on different countries' factor endowments. Let me take the point of view of poor countries. The poor countries are supposed to be more labor abundant compared to rich countries, most rich countries. So one would have expected that if, from the simple point of view, globalization, if it allows poor countries to export labor-intensive goods, it will help labor in those countries. But in many countries, it has not. And I think it's very important to discuss that aspect, and that will be related to the politics of it. First, let's say some countries have gained from globalization by tremendously expanding labor-intensive exports. China, of course, is the most successful example. But even when China now is moving away from labor-intensive exports, some other countries are picking up. And one of the most important successful cases is Vietnam. and to a small extent in India's neighborhood, Bangladesh. But Vietnam, Indonesia, some of these other countries are coming in, not so much India. And I think it's important to understand that, and therefore you will see the who is gaining and who is not will be related to that question. So I think the success of China and Vietnam, and later Vietnam, in labor intensive exports and therefore from globalization has something to do with the situation about skill formation and infrastructure, roads, ports, power, things like that. So, in fact, the skills formation, education, this is social infrastructure and physical infrastructure, roads, power, etc. China, of course, has made tremendous advance in both. And it's not an accident that they were most successful, having had the skills, the minimum skills, and certainly a great deal of infrastructure. China succeeded. Vietnam, compared to India, for example, is better in terms of education and skill formation and infrastructure. Not a great deal better, but somewhat better than India. So, contrast with India is very interesting here. Vietnam is succeeding, not India. What are the success stories of globalization in India? Success stories are in autos and auto components. Success stories are in pharmaceuticals.
India is the pharmacy of the world, they say now.
Right. Well, mostly in generic, the cheaper end, and software. So these are the success stories of India. Software is skill intensive. Pharmaceutical is skill intensive. And autos are capital intensive, relatively speaking. Not the usual labor intensive exports like textiles and clothing, furniture, toys, etc. And then later mobile consumer electronics. China and then Vietnam has succeeded in those areas, but not India. So as a result, I think the trade has created a great number of jobs in China and Vietnam, but not in India. So in a sense, the poor in India have not profited that much from globalization, whereas the poor in China and Vietnam have.
The question then is, Pranab, what is the role of domestic policy in this story? Is it domestic policies within India that were not appropriate?
That's a much more complicated story. I would say that India has not given enough incentives to policies that will help labor intensive industries. So unemployment is a huge problem. Underemployment is a huge problem in India. But apart from policies of helping those industries, India has been quite deficient in infrastructure. And India has been quite deficient in education and health for a long time. So I think we are, in a sense, in India, reaping those effects, which China certainly and Vietnam to a great extent have been much more advanced than India in both infrastructure and education.
So here then we're talking about the role of credit expansion, marketing facilities, land reform, public works programs, cash for work, all of this. And of course, as you mentioned, education and health. These need not be blocked by the forces of globalization, which is sometimes assumed to be. But of course, for these services, these things to be harnessed, you need domestic institutional reform. You need committed, visionary political leadership, but you also need popular participation. You need the administrative capacity, all of this. But that is not happening in many countries.
Right. I would say many countries, India certainly is the largest of those countries, but many countries in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, facing exactly the same problems. So going back to the issue of globalization, so the poor in these countries, latter set of countries, are not benefiting from the trade aspect of globalization. And there's one other issue about education that I wanted to mention. What education and skill formation does, which is very important for globalization, education improves your adaptability. So suppose markets shift from good A to good B. you need to adapt. You need retraining. When you are educated, it's easier for you to adapt. You and I can adapt whichever country we are in. I think an unskilled laborer might find it much more difficult, particularly in terms of production, new lines of production. So I think the adaptability and retraining is very important in globalization. Let me give you an example from a rich country. And in the rich country context, United States, the poor in United States have actually suffered from globalization, what in the United States is called the China shock because of the Chinese goods. But because of the education compared to other rich countries is less advanced in the United States, I'm talking about the education of the poor, they are less adaptable. They cannot easily shift from one job to another. So this adaptability, which comes from education plus retraining. Let me contrast that with the kind of countries you live in, say Scandinavian countries, say Denmark. Denmark has a very good active labor market policies for retraining. So when your skills become obsolete in one line of activity, you can quickly move through the state-helped retraining facilities. United States doesn't have that much.
So we're thinking about the US and the UK. We're thinking about the rise of populist politicians like the
Exactly.
Donald Trumps and Brexit happening, that kind of disenchantment.
That's what I'm going to come to. But before I do that, just let me mention, since I started by talking about exports, let me say one way globalization does help is through the imports of, because you can become a part of the global value chain. So imports of various kinds of parts and components and tasks, it is possible. So once you have those preconditions, apart from just simple exporting labor-intensive products, much larger issue, can you become a part of the global value chain? And I think China and Vietnam have succeeded in that. India and many African countries so far have not. Some countries, the social safety net is better. And certainly going back to United States compared to Scandinavia, social safety net is not good in the United States, it's patchy. It exists, but it's patchy. So countries where the social safety net is patchy, they find it more difficult to take risks of global markets. So in a sense, Scandinavian countries are better equipped to face the risks of the fluctuations and job displacements in the global market. Scandinavia is much better equipped compared to United States. The same thing is the case in countries like India. India, of course, the safety net, the social safety net is much worse than the United States even. So as a result of globalization, you have this peculiar thing, and I've seen studies. In fact, one of my students did a PhD on this. Trade expansion and then imports of components, etc., improve productivity by wiping out large number of unproductive, usually in the informal sector, unproductive firms, they got wiped out. So when they get wiped out, the average productivity in the manufacturing sector in India improved, but it didn't help the poor, because when they get wiped out, who get wiped out is that low productivity informal sector firms. So they go and then crowd the non-traded sector. So poverty does not get helped very much, even though productivity improves. This is a peculiar paradoxical thing.
I wanted to actually ask you about that. Two things. One has to do with, because you mentioned it's India and many African countries who really haven't harnessed the benefits of globalization as much as, say, Vietnam or China. So one aspect has to do with the kind of dependence of low-income countries on primary commodity exports. Of course, the prices of these often fluctuate very wildly. And the second has to do with what you just mentioned, the huge amount of people in the informal economy. And we've seen this during the COVID pandemic in India. It's a great example of how, people working in homes as domestic helps in Delhi were suddenly told to leave,
Right.
and there was this huge migration. And my friend, the late Arjun Sengupta, of course, chaired a commission in India on the informal economy. There's been quite a lot of at least academic attention, but it seemed to me that policymakers were somehow awakening to the challenges of the informal sector when the pandemic happened. So the role of primary commodities and the role of the informal sector in explaining this lack of benefits from globalization.
When I said the social safety net is missing in India, is missing in reaching out to these informal sector people.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, many of the micro enterprises in the informal sector got completely clobbered by the pandemic. And in general, they don't get that much help. But let me just, one remaining thing about globalization, I'll go then shift to the other topic. Remember I said globalization, I was talking about the trade aspect.
Yes.
There's a very important capital flows aspect of globalization. And there, I think globalization, making capital flows completely free, can hurt the poor very much. In fact, can hurt even rich countries. So what happened is that free capital flows, particularly for poor countries, increases macro instability, because this capital comes in and then goes away at very short notice. And in fact, right now, this is happening with the American interest rate going up, announcement of American interest rate going up, already capital has started moving. So this capital is extremely volatile. And that leads to a great deal of macro instability. But much more than that, free capital movement weakens labor's bargaining power. Why? Because labor is less mobile internationally than capital. So capital can always threaten that you better accept my deal, otherwise we'll go to another country. Labor cannot give that threat credibly. So free capital movement, other things remaining the same, weakens labor's bargaining power. And that is a major effect on the poor. You were asking me about the democratic disenchantment thing.
Yes.
Here, your audience may be interested to know there's a new book that is now going to press of mine on this subject.
Congratulations. You're so prolific.
It's being published by Harvard University Press. The title is A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries. This book starts by essentially saying there's a great deal of work in recent years on the rise in inequality all over the world. And that's certainly true. My friend Thomas Piketty has become very popular on this particular issue of the rising inequality. And I have no question that inequality is rising in many countries, though not in all countries, but in many countries. But to me, a lot of people connect that rise in inequality with the rise in populism, which also happened at the same time, roughly. Rise in populism that you've already referred to, in case of Trump, Brexit, and even when it has not captured the power in some European countries, right-wing parties have become much more important, say, in many countries. France, they are now an important contender in the next election. But in poor countries as well, or developing countries as well, India is a major example of rise of right-wing populism, Hindu nationalism, and Turkey is another example.
Hungary.
In Europe, when I mentioned Europe, I was not just Western Europe, but even in Central Europe, Hungary, Poland, etc. My book then goes into understanding why. So in that sense, there's a disenchantment with liberal democracy. So usually people say it's because of the rise of inequality. One of the main points in the book is that it's not so much the rise of inequality. Yes, there has been rise of inequality, in a sense, the poor working class people, they are not that much bothered about what's happening to the top 1%, because the distinction is between top 1% versus 99%. I think the poor are worried much more about the insecurity, economic insecurity certainly, but I'm going to talk about another kind of insecurity also. They are worried about insecurity in their own lives. They're not that much bothered about the top 1%. They have no idea of the top 1%, how they live, and so on. So it's the insecurity. So the whole book is really about populism or democratic disenchantment arising out of insecurity rather than inequality. Now, what kind of insecurity? The book is, of course, first starts with economic insecurity, loss of jobs, incomes, etc. By the way, both in rich and poor countries, in the United States, for example, or in Britain or in parts of Europe, I've already talked about the China shock. People lost their jobs, but since lack of adaptability, they could not move easily to other jobs. In India, we have already talked about it because of the lack of expansion in labor-intensive industries. Unemployment is a huge problem. Unemployment and underemployment. In fact, what is happening now in India, many of the people who have even stopped looking for jobs, they know there are no jobs. So in fact, India now has one of the world's lowest labor participation rate. So of the working age population, only about 43% people are in the labor force. They have stopped looking for work even, because the definition of labor force, if you're looking for work, you are included in the labor force. But many people have dropped out of the labor force. So there's a huge unemployment, underemployment problem. And to some extent, that's true of the unemployment and underemployment problem is a huge problem in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa also. In Latin American countries, it's somewhat different. There is left-wing populism sometimes, but I'm more interested in discussing at the moment the right-wing populism. The left-wing populism, the extreme example in Latin America is Venezuela. But right-wing populism has come out of these issues of job losses and economic insecurity. The working class find this is a huge problem in their life, which the traditional parties have not been able to solve, so they are moving to populist. But the immediate question that comes to your mind is, why are they moving right, not left? Whether it's in Europe or the United States or in India.
I have an answer to that.
Go ahead.
So I'm thinking it is what has traditionally been the focus of right-wing parties: law and order, security, immigration control. What do you think?
Yes, and that's where I'm coming to. And I'm saying here you cannot explain only by economic insecurity. The other kind of insecurity I discuss a great deal in my book. I'm giving it a general name, but it includes some of the things that you just mentioned. I am calling it cultural insecurity of various kinds. And in Europe, immigration is a major cultural insecurity issue, because they think they had a traditional culture which is being disrupted by these people who are coming from elsewhere with a different culture. And so immigration can be an issue of economic insecurity, but it can also be an issue of cultural insecurity. In fact, I would say it's more cultural than economic. And again, compared to United States to Europe, there's big difference. One is, since the social safety net is much stronger in Europe than in the United States, you will see the immigration issue is the major issue in populism. Whereas in the United States, immigration is one issue, but the China shock, job loss, is a major issue. At least when there is a job loss in some West European countries, the safety net being there is less salient as an issue. So the cultural immigration issue becomes much more important. I think at this point I should mention what exactly do I mean by populism. There are various meanings. The particular sense I'm taking populism to be populism that gets is impatient with liberal procedures, liberal institutions, populism that goes into what is called majoritarianism. A majority community tries to become dominant, tries to ride roughshod over minorities. And related to that is the issue of ethnic nationalism, which I think is a very important aspect of populism. In fact, I have whole chapters on this. So, for example, in India, in the United States, the nationalism that was emphasized was one of what I call civic nationalism. Nationalism that is based on pluralist values embedded in the constitution. The Hindu nationalists in India want a different kind of nationalism, which is ethnic nationalism, which is the majority community, which is Hindus, is the majoritarianism. And the same in the United States. It has a constitutional nationalism, civic nationalism, but the new right-wing populists want to emphasize the white nationalism, the majoritarian. Now, once you talk about culture, of course, is different in different countries. Even if the economic issue is similar, like lack of jobs, job displacement, cultural response to it is different. So let me give you an example. In the United States, in UK, which groups are going to the right-wing populists? You will see in general, these are more rural, less educated, older people. In UK, the Brexit, if you look at the support base of Brexit, more rural, less educated, older people, not people around London. People around London did not vote for Brexit. It's the Midlands and the Northern. Same with the United States. The more rural, less educated, older. Contrast that with India. In India, the right-wing Hindu nationalists, the BJP, the major support base is quite often urban, younger. Because of the cultural thing is different, you get different groups. If you go to Turkey, again, it's not like India. In Turkey, the major support base for Erdogan is rural and less educated. And it's very interesting to contrast Turkey with India in this context. BJP has major support in the big metropolitan cities. Delhi, I'm talking about the last national election, 2019 national election, major support in Delhi, Mumbai, etc. If you go to Turkey, Erdogan does not get support from Istanbul or Ankara. The major metropolitan cities in Turkey are not in favor of this right-wing populism, Islamic populism in Turkey. So I discuss different cases of cultural populism that way, but democratic disenchantment is taking place in all these places. But essentially going back, let me say, I first discussed the economic insecurity issue, which is different, qualitatively different issue from economic inequality issue. And then I go into cultural insecurity. And then cultural insecurity takes different forms in different countries.
One of the things that I thought of when you were discussing the main argument of your book is that you really are interested and have been working for decades on political economy, right? So I was reading your memoirs and you mentioned how at Presidency University, it used to be called Presidency College in Kolkata, the Department of Economics had also political science involved. And hearing you speak, I feel like, you're a political scientist in addition to being an economist. So I'm just thinking about the fact that you wrote also another popular book a few years ago, I think over a decade ago, called Awakening Giants, Feet of Clay, Assessing the Economic Rise of China and India. And when you think about what you just said about, the democratic disenchantment in rich and poor countries, obviously the question is, how does this play out in democratic versus non-democratic settings? And in The Awakening Giants, of course, you discuss the relationship between democracy and development, but you also caution people from reaching too quick a conclusion that authoritarianism is good or democracy is bad. So in hindsight, it seems that this new book is like a follow-up, a volume 2 of that Awakening Giants book. How do you see then that relationship, this disenchantment within democracies and in non-democracies?
In fact, this book has one long chapter on the title, I think, called The Temptation of Authoritarianism. I think on the issue of democracy and development, which is the broader issue that you are raising, first thing to discuss is what does one mean by development? So, for example, China has developed a great deal. In fact, performance in China has been much better than elsewhere, certainly in India. But in China, the leaders know what is good for you. If you're a poor person, the leaders know what is good for you. Okay, by and large, their judgment have been good in respect of what the poor people may want. They may not do what you may want. I call this the infantilizing of the poor. We know what is good for you. We'll give it to you.
The benevolent leaders.
Benevolent leader. Same in Singapore. The leaders know what is good for you. Now, do you want that life? So I think that's very important too. If you say, oh, per capita income has gone up, poverty has declined, and so on. But is that all the poor people really want? And I'll give you an example where it will be clear cut. And that example goes into the issue of land acquisition, which is a huge issue both in India and China. China, whenever for building a road or building a factory, didn't even consult anybody. They just went ahead, bulldozed, and acquired the land. In India, there have been big agitations, and one of the blocks of industrialization and infrastructure development in India has the land is difficult to acquire. It's not just land for road building or land for factory building. This also involves environment, because manufacturing and mining often degrades the environment. So there have been many cases in India where the tribal people have protested. You want to build this mine, you want to build this factory, but we won't allow you because you are trampling upon our ancestral land. We worship our ancestors and so on. So there, China wouldn't even pay 1 minute's attention to that. But in India, you have to, because you depend on these people's votes. So here is a case. You might tell this tribal person who's protesting, your life will be much better. Once the factory comes, he might reply, we don't care. We don't want our ancestors' land to be trampled upon. So the question is, there, of course, you can't go to extreme in either ways. But China goes to one extreme. You should not go to the other extreme, but you have to pay respect to these people's opinions. And that's where my first point is, whose development? Is this what they want? So don't infantilize the poor. Number two, of course, democracy is very slow. In deciding on anything, it takes a lot of time. The democratic deliberation process is slow. China can decide on something in 1 day or less than a day. But the question is, this is related to the question that I mentioned just now, is this legitimate? I think the legitimacy of the decision that you are taking is very important in development process, in my judgment. So democracy's decisions are slow, but I think more legitimate. Legitimate from the point of view of downward accountability, whereas in China, you don't have that. But there's another aspect of this decision process that I want to go into. In China, because of this kind of decision process, what happens in times of crisis, they overreact. The leadership overreacts, suppresses information, and act heavy-handedly. And this suppression of information is very important in the development, in the decision process. So I'll give you two examples. One is from the recent COVID pandemic. So remember when it started in Wuhan, China, in December 2019. you know probably about this doctor, Chinese doctor in Wuhan, who started telling people, look, what I'm seeing, this is not ordinary pneumonia. Well, people are talking it's pneumonia. He says, no, it's a different virus. He kept on telling everybody. But people didn't listen because they didn't want to rock the boat. They always have a tendency to suppress bad news because the leaders don't like bad news. They shoot the messenger. In fact, in this case, this doctor who was trying to warn everybody in Wuhan, he got arrested by the police. On what charge? He was spreading false rumors. As a result, China got delayed in finally waking up to this new pandemic. And as a result, the whole world got delayed in waking up to this pandemic. So it's not merely affected China, it of course affected the whole world, this delay. So this choking of information in decision making, I think is very an important negative thing about authoritarian countries. Let me give you just one other example from China. China is now going to have this week the start of a new Olympic, the Winter Olympics. But if you remember the last Olympic that China had in Beijing, 2008, the Summer Olympics, and I think it's mentioned in my Awakening Giants book, just before the Olympics came, the journalists found out a scandalous story of tainted milk supply. Milk that children drink, they found a contamination in the milk supply on a very large scale. Immediately, the authorities said, no, don't publicize it, because the world's attention now is on Beijing because of the Olympics. So they suppressed that news. These journalists, by the way, I read some interviews, these journalists told their relatives, don't drink the milk, but they did not publicize it. Because of the Olympics are coming, the whole world's attention. As a result, about 300,000 children got sick, 300,000, and some died. So that tells you, is this the kind of development? So it goes back to the decision process and the kind of development and legitimacy of development that becomes very important.
You've been highlighting how important the lack of democratic accountability has been in China. And for me, the classic case, and through my PhD looking at Amartya Sen's work, etc., is what happened during the Great Leap Forward, the famine. An estimated 35 million people died, not because the state wasn't able to do anything, but because there was no freedom of speech and information was suppressed. So Mao, in many ways, could have reacted earlier. So the role of informal, democratic early warning was not there in China, which caused that. But of course, you've raised the more sort of recent example of the pandemic. I wanted to then ask you about India, because you mentioned all of these things about democracy that is good in India. Obviously, one thinks about the Narmada Dam case, where a dam is just not built for 30 years because of protests, etc. So that is the obvious distinction between India and China. But there are, as you mentioned, there's this energetic participation by the poor in democratic politics, every 5 years. There's been protests by farmers in recent years, the last 2 years, and they won, by the way. It was a huge lobby. You would imagine that democracy in India unleashes both the positive and the negative aspects of development. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes. The negative is that politicians, because their horizon is short, they just want to win the next election, they emphasize the short term. So whatever they pander to the electorate, and I'll give you examples, which is very harmful. Come election time, in many states, the politicians will offer free electricity, free water. Just imagine what happens to the prospect of long-term investment in water and electricity. So as a result, the long-term suffers, but short-term they win the election. So this is what I call pandering. So democracy leads to this pandering, and there are ways of stopping it. You should take out some of these long-term decisions from these politicians, give it to some independent autonomous bodies which doesn't have to win the next election. In fact, in UK, the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, is a semi-autonomous body. So they, even though the Conservatives won and wanted Brexit, BBC took an anti-Brexit position, which is impossible in China and now increasingly impossible in right-wing populist government in India. But pandering is one negative aspect. Second is, and this related, let me give you the example of Mumbai. Mumbai is in some sense the richest city, the financial capital of India. But if you go to Mumbai, particularly foreigners who go to Mumbai, always tell me, urban infrastructure is so bad. They're much worse in different parts of India, but this is the financial capital. You don't have a corresponding level of urban infrastructure. I remember once Financial Times correspondent, a young Englishman, who's just arrived in Mumbai, who was shocked by the state of Mumbai urban infrastructure. So he was asking me, so why is this? I said, look, this is in some sense related to democracy. Mumbai, being the financial capital of India, raises a lot of revenue for the government. But that revenue does not get spent in Mumbai. Where does the revenue get spent? In the whole state of Maharashtra, of which Mumbai is a part, the dominant political groups are in the rural sector. The farm lobbies, the sugar lobbies, those are very important in the totality of picture of Maharashtrian state politics. So even though the revenue is raised from Mumbai, the revenue gets spent elsewhere, not in Mumbai, not as much. So democracy has that, where the numbers are more important, rural sector there, the numbers are more important, therefore the farm lobbies, the sugar lobbies in Maharashtra, they dominate. So that's the other aspect, the short-term aspect and the numbers aspect, depending on the allocation of money, where it will go. And the third problem in democracy, increasingly, is that democracy is regularly undermined, particularly in the United States and increasingly in India, by the role of money in elections. Today, I mean, the amount of money, where unlimited amount of money people can raise. I hear already that Trump, for the next 2024 election, has already raised $100 million in his war chest. And I'm sure there will be much more when the 2024 election comes. In India, they have a system of what is now called electoral bonds, where any businessman can donate. You don't have to disclose the amount, an unlimited amount. No limits, no disclosure. It's called electoral bond. You buy a bond of the State Bank of India and anybody can donate. So big corporate houses donate. But since the State Bank of India is a government bank, the government knows who's the donor. And as a result, you are a corporate house. If you're going to donate to the opposition, you can buy bonds. But you know the government knows. Government will know. So even though the public will not know, the government will know. So in general, you give more to the ruling party. In fact, already some evidence that at least 3/4 of those donations are going to the ruling party. And as a result, there's a quid pro quo. When the businessmen donate, they expect something in return. And therefore, in fact, some people say in the United States, laws are for sale, goes to the highest bidder. So that's another bad aspect of democracy.
Some of these arguments you raise are precisely the arguments that Chinese policymakers highlight as the big problem. And that is why they believe democracy wouldn't work in China, because prosperity, the growing prosperity of the middle class, all of this is dependent on the party state to guarantee law and order, to avoid all of these uncomfortable side effects of democratic elections, which brings me to another area that you have done extensive work on, which is the corruption development nexus. And I vividly remember reading a piece you wrote many years ago where you actually compared Indonesia and India, because in that piece you said that both countries, have high levels of corruption. And this was a time you were looking at Suharto's time in
Right.
Indonesia, and you highlighted the important role that bribery or centralized bribes have. That corruption can actually, like you were saying about these business houses, corruption could be very effective if you bribed the really important politicians, which was happening in Indonesia, Suharto and his cronies. Whereas in India, you said, and you highlighted that corruption was at the low level. And that is why corruption was not benefiting development. So Pranab, all of these decades later, do you still believe that centralization of bribery is important?
I think it depends on what you mean by corruption. I think it's very important to distinguish between two types of corruption. One type of corruption, the term that you just mentioned, it happens in the low level every day. So in India, if you stand in a street corner where the traffic is being directed by a lowly constable, with one hand he's showing which way the cars should go. The other hand is stretched out, essentially as passing trucks, passing lorries will put some money because they are probably carrying above the weight they're supposed to carry or whatever. They're violating some law. So they just donate coins on the outstretched hand of the constable. So you see that all the time, and you know how corrupt India is. But I tell people, if you add up all these coins that are put in the hands of the outstretched hand of thousands and thousands of policemen, it will be much less than the corruption in one single transaction of the US Defense Department when they buy a big military aircraft. Because that's closed door, one transaction, but it's such a huge transaction. So I think one should distinguish between petty corruption and grand corruption.
But some would say it's the corruption of need versus corruption of greed.
There is greed in also on both cases. The cases that I just mentioned, there's greed on both sides. Is the scale. Since we see it all the time in the street, we think there's a lot more. But more in what respect? Probably in terms of value, this military aircraft buying, which by the way happens in India also, when they buy military aircraft, there's probably more corruption there, the grand corruption. But there is another way you can classify this. One is kind of corruption where you bribe a little bit to the clerk so that your file moves faster, which sometimes is called speed money. This is actually part of petty corruption. But the other kind, which is much more insidious, is where you bribe the official to look the other way, not doing what she would otherwise supposed to do, as in the case of pushing the file, but look the other way. The official does something he's not supposed to do. So you are a smuggler and the official the customs officer looks the other way in exchange of a bribe. You are a tax evader, the tax assessor guy looks the other way. Or you are a polluter, the environmental inspector looks the other way. So the official does things which he's not supposed to do. And this is much more insidious because think of the smuggler, think of the tax evader. There, both the briber and the bribee have the interest in not reporting. Whereas the clerk whom you are paying to push the file, you are very reluctantly doing it. And in fact, if you have a chance, you complain about it. So you have an incentive to report. So the petty corruption gets reported more often than these other kinds of corruption. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. All this is possible because the service provider has a monopoly power, because you can't get that service anywhere else. Now, let me give you the example how technology is now changing it over time. So suppose you want for your passport. In India, for example, the passport offices, if you go to the passport office, So a tout will come and says, sir, I'll get your passport. Done, you pay me so much. Now that corruption is declining. You know why? It's because of technology.
Yes.
Now the government has authorized many agents where you can online apply for passport, and you will get your passport and maybe by mail, etc. So the monopoly aspect of the service is declining because of technology has made it more possible. So the government keeps some broad supervision, but had outsourced it to large number of passport agents.
I'm still wondering, Pranab, why is it that, in many instances, corruption is actually oiling the machinery, where speed money helps, where access money is good. And I'm thinking about China. Obviously, if you look at China, India, that relationship or that distinction, both countries have high levels of corruption, but on every development indicator, China is better than India. Could you say whether some forms of corruption are more beneficial than others?
Well, the greasing point that people say is certainly get things moving, but there is a long-term effect of that. And this is a long-term effect I also discuss in this paper on corruption of mine that you referred to. I think sometimes corruption is there when you think everybody else is corrupt, which is essentially in economics is a coordination failure problem. When I think that other people are honest, I then think twice in being dishonest. So this, even it helps to grease that aspect, it creates an atmosphere of everybody being corrupt. So corruption becomes very difficult to get rid of. But the other aspect that you are emphasizing, which was in my original article, the centralization aspect. I think centralizing certainly gets rid of some anarchic aspect of corruption. Suppose you have to get your some license or whatever, you pay somebody, and then after you finish your payment, somebody else says, oh no, you have to pay me too. And then somebody else says, you have to pay me. Because a lot of officials have some veto power. This is the decentralized aspect that I'm talking about. That may increase corruption. In fact, let me tell you an anecdote. In Delhi, somebody whose file was blocked in some office, he called a friend who is high-powered in that office. He said, look, my file is blocked. Can you do something about it? This friend said, sorry, I can't help push your file. What I can do, if you want me to stop a file, I can do that.
So the stopping power of the bureaucrat is important.
But I call this in one paper, I called it multiple veto power system. And Indian bureaucracy has that multiple veto power system, which the Chinese doesn't have. Chinese, the higher up officials, you cannot, a lower down or somebody else there you cannot veto it.
Yeah.
So I call it the decentralized, the anarchic part of corruption is less in China. However, for a different reason, China has more corruption. And that is, well, of course, China is richer, so each deal is much more money to be made out of it. But even apart from that, because there is no scrutiny, if a party, a big boss in a party, want to have a corrupt deal, and I'll just give you an example of a recent paper. There's a lot of data on Chinese corruption. No newspaper is going to write against it. No TV is going to talk about it because information is suppressed, censored, and everything. So because there are no checks and balances, it can make you more corrupt because you can get away with more corruption. And let me give you that example. In a recent article, 2 Chinese economists have written this, and these data are from millions, not just thousands, millions of land transaction data. and they have analyzed those. They find in China, you give land deals to business, local business or super local business, and that the party secretaries decide. So this paper shows that provincial party secretaries, in selling local land to business, the business quite often is connected with a Communist Party member. So suppose you are a Politburo member. This paper shows on an average, if you are a Politburo member, you get a 60% discount in getting the land. Okay? So that's how the big grand corruption takes place in China. In return, this is a quid pro quo deal. In return, the same paper shows the provincial party secretary, which gives this land to you, you are a Politburo member, and then you have your business with that land. In return, and this is one of the findings of the paper, such discount givers have a 23% more likely to be promoted to positions of national leadership. So there's a quid pro quo, promotion of party officials, and you give them these land deals. So I would say both India and China, the grand corruption is in the form of the nexus between business and top politicians. In India now they call it crony capitalism. A few business houses, whether it's Ambani's, Adani's, and a few others, get special deals from the government. Same thing in China. The Chinese, of course, now have a big anti-corruption movement, but what I hear that those are also often against the political rivals of the top leadership. So it's against particular people. But in both countries, the business politics nexus is the main cause of grand corruption. But I would say it's more in China, this grand corruption, because there is no checks and balances. Newspapers, TV stations will not write about it. There is no scrutiny. There will not be public movement like what in 2012, there was an Anna Hazare movement in India. Impossible to think about in China. But unfortunately, having said all this, unfortunately, on this matter, India is approaching China because, again, now, if you want to criticize the top leadership in India, it's very difficult to do. It's not impossible, very difficult to do because the media is very much in control or in suppressed by the top government. So in this respect, India is approaching China in the wrong aspect, I would say.
You've been working on development issues for decades. You've had this distinguished career from Cambridge to Berkeley to MIT, India. You've been teaching development economics, political economy for all of these years. When you now think about the immediate future, given that we've been in the pandemic, a lot of the development progress that we had achieved over the years, some of it has been reversed, some of it has been halted. People are talking about the rise of China, the rivalry between China and the United States, how India is hedging its bet on the Quad. There are all of these changes in world order. So when you sitting in Berkeley now, on Berkeley Hills, thinking about world development, what are your thoughts about the immediate future? Where are we going to see the next sort of big shift? Is it the growth of the Chinese economy? Will it stagnate? What is India going to do? And then finally, what about all of these countries in sub-Saharan Africa where there's still the need for economic growth? There's still need for redistribution of that growth. Is this going to happen in the near future? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I don't know how to interpret your question. Is it a question about what I predict, or is it a question of what I'd like to see?
Both. Let's start with prediction and then the hope and aspiration.
Prediction I'm very bad at. And in fact, I always remember Galbraith, what he said, economists are at their worst when they take the function of astrologers. and I'm not the only economist in as bad predictors. There have been many people who have been bad predictors. The geopolitical China-United States thing is probably going to get worse. However, and this is probably more wishful thinking, I think both sides know the limits. So it will get worse, but not too much.
Yeah.
But one never knows. If 2024 Trump comes to power, then all bets are off, as they say. But the geopolitical situation will get worse. I think the major issue, if you look at the economic issues, I think there will be attempts in different countries for the tremendous rise in inequality, etc. I think in reaction, people will realize. I think even corporate sector is become a little more sensitive to issues of inequality. So I expect better things, not a great deal better, but some better things to happen in the economic issue. In the issue of environment, which is the looming problem, economic as well as social, there I am less hopeful. Or I would say my prediction is not as rosy as some other people have. I think there will be actions. In fact, there's a lot of popular movement, certainly in the Western countries. There will be some measures will be done. But I think the international coordination that is needed, it's a global public good. Environment is a global public good. So international coordination, my prediction is that will only happen to a very limited extent. That there will be some improvement, but I think the next 100 years, the global temperature is going to go up by much more than this 2% that people are aiming at. And even that, people are promising, but not keeping to those promises, etc. In terms of what I hope will, in fact, last chapter of my forthcoming book is on that, the policies to be taken. There, I talk about both rich and poor countries, but I do emphasize international coordination, various aspects of international. And international coordination is happening. For example, even as recently as a few months back, the different countries agreed on a minimum tax rate on the corporations, 15%. So there are issues of agreement, but environment will be more difficult to come to agreement on, but I think there will be some progress. I think apart from the environmental problem, the major problem in all countries, but particularly in developing countries, is that of employment. And I shudder, and this is where, going back to the quest prediction, I shudder to think in Africa and in countries like India and parts of Latin America, the unemployment and underemployment problem is so huge that it is going to explode in the politics. Already you see that. In fact, in the right-wing populist, right-wing parties in India, the youth gangs, lynch mobs. Who are these? These are unemployed people. So they go and do these things for the gangs which are affiliated to the ruling party. And this will happen all over. What people can do will much depend, apart from tinkering of policies, I think which way technology moves, the way artificial intelligence and other technologies are moving is going to displace jobs. And I think this is where a very important aspect, and I discuss this in my book, is there are ways of trying to move technology in some directions. In fact, the economist Daron Acemoglu is writing quite a bit on this. He's saying that we are getting artificial intelligence and other in the automation direction. It need not move that way. Instead of labor displacement, you can have labor enhancing technological progress. Technological progress will create more jobs rather than displace them. And that, who decides which way the technology moves, will much depend on corporate governance. Much of it is in the private sector, but the public sector is involved because quite often the public sector gives capital subsidies, which then encourages automation in technological progress. Remove these capital subsidies, remove the fuel subsidies, etc., which can try to move technology, in the case of environment, toward renewable technology, in the case of jobs, toward labor-enhancing technology rather than labor-displacing technology. So those are areas where I would concentrate on: international coordination in environment and trade and intellectual property kinds of issues, and in these technology policies, and in these job policies, etc. And in fact, whole of my last chapter of my book is forthcoming book is on these issues.
Well, I can't wait to read your forthcoming book. I hope it comes out soon.
It will be coming out at the end of this summer.
Oh, great. I've had such a great fun speaking with you today, Pranab. You've inspired me over many years, and as you have many students and colleagues, I'm sure, all over the world. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please spread the news among your friends and share it on social media. The Twitter handle for this podcast is GlobalDevPod.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Bannock from the University of Oslo's Center for Development and the Environment. Please email your questions, comments, and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.